everyone. Welcome to our latest webinar. Thank you all for being here. My name is Basma Momani. I'm Associate Vice President for Interdisciplinary Research at the University of Waterloo. I'm also Director of the Defense and Security Foresight Group, and I'm really happy to be partnering with the AI Institute at the University of Waterloo in this series. Today we're going to be talking about what happens when AI fails and who is responsible. If you haven't had a chance to check us out and our number of webinars before this, I encourage you to do so. We'll put a link soon to where you can find some of our past webinars. And we have been really looking at the various ways that AI and military applications are concerned. We're very pleased to have two great colleagues today. We're having a challenge with one of our colleagues, but I'm sure we'll have that worked out. And I'll introduce them in a moment. But if I may, I'll take the opportunity to provide our land acknowledgement. The University of Waterloo acknowledges that much of our work takes place on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. Our main campus is situated on the Holloman Tract, the land granted to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Our active work toward reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and is centralized within our Indigenous Initiatives Office. So thank you for all attending. If I may, I'm going to first introduce my colleague, Dr. Alex Wilner. Alex is Associate Professor at the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University in Ottawa. He is a leading scholar on contemporary deterrence theory and practice. His research, which explores the nexus between deterrence theory and emerging security considerations, domains, and environments, has shaped the 4th and now 5th generation of deterrence scholarship. Among his over 24 journal publications, his articles on the subject of deterring terrorism and cyber deterrence have been published in top-ranked IR journals. We're very happy to have you, Alex. Thank you for being here. I see that we're still waiting for Eleanor to join us. So if I may, I'll start with you, Alex. And I'd love for you to first just give us, your quick take on this very broad topic of basically AI and deterrence. And please give us your thoughts on that.
Great. Thanks. Well, thank you, Professor Momani and Eleanor. When you come, it's a pleasure to be working with you. So my comments today are largely derived from a specific research project that I'm running now. It's called the AI Deterrence Project. I've received since 2019 2 rounds of funding from the Department of National Defense, specifically the IDEAS program, which is Innovation in Defense Excellence and Security Program, which was announced in 2017 Canada Defense Policy to invest $2 billion in innovation and emerging technology. And so I'm really applying a social science lens to AI as it relates specifically to deterrence, coercion, and national security. So a lot of my comments will be based on this project. I do want to start, though, with a definition, I think, of the context within which we're talking about. So defining, if we can, artificial intelligence. And I think that'll lead us then to a better discussion of what we actually mean by failure, and then an exploration of how failure intersects with geopolitics. So the amount of scientific literature on artificial intelligence that explores its application across industry and society is absolutely staggering. And yet, I think we could agree that there's actually no actual definition of AI. It seems difficult to do so. I think the field is marked by different technological approaches that attempt to accomplish different and sometimes divergent scientific tasks. And so some scholars like Peter Norvig and Stuart Russell, who himself has suggested and warned that the development of AI could be as dangerous as the development of nuclear weapons, right? They describe a number of AI taxonomies, including systems that think and act like humans, so they mimic human intelligence, and those that think and act rationally, so they solve problems and behave accordingly. But developing a singular definition that can capture all of this, I think, is difficult. But also perhaps it's maybe not absolutely that necessary. Maybe the better way or the better strategy is to think of AI as a field of study like geography or even political science, mathematics, etc. And so I think in this vein, right, AI is a field of science that attempts to provide machines with problem solving, reasoning, and learning qualities that are akin to human qualities. Now, another way to think of AI and then therefore to define it is to apply a wave analogy to its development. The first wave helped train computers to complete specific tasks. And the process works by taking particular facts derived from a particular system, like playing chess, for instance, and then turning those facts into rules that a computer can understand and then act upon. I think first wave was able to excel at certain tasks, but they weren't really able to learn or to abstract from those specific rules for other wider applications. Second wave scholarship and research uses statistical learning to train AI to use probabilistic reasoning in handling and interpreting data and other types of information. And so training data is now used to help a computer learn and adapt to new and then fresh data. That's pretty innovative, right? And so there's recent advancements in machine learning, deep learning, neural nets are, I think, embedded in this second wave of research. And I think progression in voice and facial recognition and other types of endeavor, for instance, are the best known results. I think second wave AI excels at classifying data, but it's also perhaps finds it difficult to then apply the same reasoning principles and adapt to different domains. I think it's extremely difficult. It's still very specific to a specific problem and task. Third wave of AI, I think, is where we're at now. It's where it's being developed, and I think there's some holy grails embedded in there. It's built around contextual adaptation, such that AI systems will build explanatory models themselves, against which they will then learn, reason, and continue to extrapolate within and then beyond those specific applications. I think in practice, when you boil all of the scientific and technological developments down, you can divide AI and then define it, if you wish, on its capabilities. And I think probably this is how most of us here today look at it this way. You've probably heard of, at least, the terms of narrow AI versus general AI. So I'm going to stop here with the definitions and then I'll move on to deterrence. But narrow AI is developed and used to accomplish a specific task, like playing poker or playing Go, right? It's designed to recognize and categorize specific objects and people and speech. It can be used in video content, right? It accomplishes a specific task. I think in the past decade and a half, narrow AI has proven exceptionally competent at accomplishing these specific tasks, far outstripping sometimes, dramatically far outstripping human competitors along the way. So for illustration, right, a deep neural network, a type of machine learning algorithm, can be trained on millions of pictures of human faces. We all know this, in order to then eventually predict whether a new picture includes a human face, right? The algorithm learns on its own, often through trial and error. That's how this form of narrow AI has been able to crush human competitors at various board and computer games. And yet, right, notwithstanding its success, success in one field, it's not always able to then be applied to another field. So narrow AI is limited. It's narrow in its composition. General AI, or AGI for short, it picks up where narrow AI ends. It's to empower a computer to learn, adapt, and solve any number of problems, much as you and I would as humans. And for now, I think general AI is really science fiction. It's the holy grail. It's the stuff of the Terminator franchise, Battlestar Galactica, Westworld, right? We know a lot about it because we've seen it in fiction, but it's not the stuff of science just yet. I think it is the holy grail. And I think there are a number of different laboratories working on AGI. And yet, when we talk about failure, we often relate it to this idea of a super intelligent figure. And so our conversations about failure are sometimes skewed by a concern of this super intelligence being. But if you think about it, right, and Swedish philosopher Nick Bostrom has done this repeatedly over the last, I would say, decade, he's found that, and he's the founder of the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford, he's warned, right, that a super intelligent being will outcompete humans in all endeavors. So you and I, we're not going to find it a very welcoming environment. But at the same time, he suggests that there's only a 60, 70, maybe 80% likelihood of a super intelligent being developed over the next 70 to 80 years. So we still have a lot of time to worry about that possibility. And so what I really want to do, right, and this is what I'm trying to anchor our discussion, is to explore the ramifications of narrow AI, not general AI, narrow AI on the things that we do in geopolitical space. And so my bottom line then is that the best general purpose computer is still the human being, right? And that puts the context of failure into some relief. Now, let me wrap up then with some comments on the AI Deterrence project, and specifically how they relate to deterrence and coercion, geopolitics, but also failure. We did, and I'm saying we because I had 3 PhD students working with me on this. We did dozens of interviews in the United States, UK, Israel, Europe, etc., trying to look at the social science of deterrence, relating it to AI. And here I'm talking about all forms of deterrence, not just strategic or nuclear deterrence, but all forms of state and non-state aggression, terrorism, even criminality. And so all told, right, I think there's some forms of AI will hinder deterrence, but in elsewhere, it might actually augment deterrence. So let me unpack these two as I wrap up. Now, in some cases, AI might diminish deterrence or augment the risk of deterrence failure. And for illustration, right, AI increases the risk of hyperwar by shortening that distance from intelligence gathering and assessment to decision-making and military action. And it will do so, I think, shortening that loop by making better sense of a huge amount of data very quickly and detecting those anomalies in a superhuman approach to things. So in terms of speed, precision, and so forth. Now, if AI creates the perception among nuclear rivals, for instance, that one country has the ability to detect and then target all of another nation's nuclear weapon launchers, which is infeasible today, but a possibility tomorrow, then that vulnerable state will be inclined, I think, especially inclined to use those weapons more quickly at the risk of losing them altogether, right? So other states looking at this may also calculate that many more such weapons will be needed to spoof the AI that's looking for them. That leads to nuclear proliferation and miscalculation and all the rest. So that's not great news. I think fighting at machine speed may change the calculus of taking action, even in those non-nuclear situations. And so if an AI-based decision maker provides one side of a conflict with an advantage in responding quickly, then another state, adversary state, will likely try to mimic those processes. And that gets us into this really funky world, right? In which you've got one state AI battling another state's AI. But as both sides of a contest come to rely on machines for novel insights, the very rationale of those AI-generated insights degrade more quickly. Again, machines are able to do things more quickly than we are to do so. And so that creates that my side's AI and the time that I have to respond is shortened. And I think the effect here is a need to act quickly and decisively. Otherwise, you perhaps lose that short window opportunity, providing your adversary's AI with an opportunity to find its own short window of opportunity. And that creates a spiral, I think, down. Finally, I think correctly gauging a country's prowess in AI, their capability, is open to misinterpretation. And that invites coercive miscalculation along the way. IR is full of miscalculations and the wars that resulted as a result of that. And so a challenger, the one being deterred looking in, right, may be unable to properly gauge an adversary's power when that power is derived from AI. It's basically software. And so compared to traditional notions of power, which might have been gauged on economic output or military leadership or even the types of armaments, AI power is less measurable. And so that invites miscalculation and may diminish deterrence over a period. Now, to finish, right, on the flip side, I think AI can help rather than hinder deterrence in some cases. It may alter cost-benefit calculations by removing the fog of war, by diminishing the human cost of military threats, by making some threats more credible and more useful as a result. AI might also remove human emotions and eliminate other biological limitations from the practice of coercion. It may provide users the ability to collect and synthesize and act on real-time intelligence from several sources. That augments the certainty and I think the severity of some of our punishment strategies. And so for similar reasons, AI might likewise improve a state's capability in military planning, in logistics, in communications, recruitment, all that stuff, right? This is the back office AI. It better coordinates the machinery of warfare, and that leads to more complex coercive threats being realistic. In the long term, I think by providing unique advice to decision makers that supersedes human innovation, and we're not quite here yet, but I think we're there soon, I think AI may prove its value in providing situational awareness that dips into predictive analytics. AI may provide users with the ability to anticipate an adversary's next move right now, not tomorrow, but right now. And that allows the defender to preempt a response and to influence adversary behavior, coercively or otherwise, in that speed. And remember, deterrence works by adding to the costs through punishment or by subtracting from the benefits, right? That's the cost-benefit calculation. So good defense equals good deterrence by denial. And so better defense, it gets you better denial. And so AI, by improving the speed and accuracy of some defensive weapons, might deter some types of behavior more fulsomely. And finally, I want to dip into the speculative just one more time. The development of autonomous weapons, right, will lead to the potentially rapid development of new military tactics. This is shifting the traditional divide between offense and defense and between punishment and denial in terms of coercion. And so you can let your imagination run here a little bit, but imagine new saturation tactics, right? This is in which thousands of miniature, perhaps 3D printed, cheaply made drones, right, are used to swarm and overwhelm a more traditional and much more powerful target. Now, on its own, a single unmanned autonomous unit is no match for a fighter jet or a destroyer or some other thing. But if you algorithmically lasso these thousands of drones together, you get a fleet. And a fleet of 1,000 might simply overwhelm these larger, slower systems of war, including fighter jets or naval ships or even fixed land bases. And so the tactic lends itself to both offensive and defensive processes. Again, here the innovation is in the imagination, it's in the use of AI rather than simply access to it. And this provides a nimble adversary, strong, powerful, weak, or otherwise, with a coercive advantage. All to say then, I think as a scholar of deterrence, I can't think of a more exciting topic to unpack and to study. If AI is, and I think it is, the future of conflict and war, then AI deterrence is also the future. And what it will look like and how this will affect our societies and international relations and how we relate it back to failure, I think is yet to be determined. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. That's really lots of food for thought. Thank you, Eleanor, for joining us. Sorry you had some technical challenges, but we're really happy to have you here. So if I may, I'm going to introduce you now. Eleanor Powell is a senior fellow with the Global Center on Cooperative Security. Eleanor conducts in-depth research on the security and governance implications generated by the convergence of AI with other dual-use technologies, including cybersecurity, genomics, and genome editing. Eleanor provides expertise to the World Bank and the UN, as well as to several governments and private sector actors on AI cyber prevention, the changing nature of conflict, foresight, and global security. In 2018-2019, Eleanor served as research fellow on emerging cyber technologies for the UN University Center for Policy Research, and at Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, she spent 10 years with the Science and Technology Innovation Program, leading the Anticipatory Intelligence Lab. And she's also part of the scientific committee of the International Association for Responsible Research Innovation, Genome Editing. And she's also former official of the European Commission's Directorate on Science, Economy, and Society. Thanks for joining us, Eleanor. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much, Besma. All my apologies for the difficulty in launching the program. Thank you so much for your time. So good afternoon, Besma and Alex. It's a great pleasure to be sharing insights with you today. I wanted to start with a caveat explaining that I approach our webinar with a humanitarian and international security angle. And so I think it's really useful because I'm going to provide another perspective than what Alex has been very eloquently sharing. And so I would like to simply start by taking a step back and frame our discussion by looking at two strategic issues. First, how AI is potentially changing the nature of warfare and conflict and impacting conflict prevention. And second, what are new AI techniques and targets in cyber warfare and what AI failures mean in that context. And then thereafter, we can discuss together how to approach concept of responsibility, accountability, and mitigation in a geopolitical context of multipolar competition, what is often called conflicts in the gray zone. So I think we need to take a step back because the center of gravity for at least some conflict is shifting away from targeting military forces towards targeting critical cyber and physical infrastructures, political and electoral processes, and the social cohesion of targeted population. And there is an urgent need to understand how AI converges with other dual-use technologies and integrates with critical infrastructure to amplify the complex, hybrid, and unconventional aspects of cyber warfare. So that's a little bit more the angle I'm gonna take. In this context, we could define two socio-technical shifts that are affecting the nature of tech-driven conflicts and conflict prevention. The first one is automation. The capacity of AI systems to develop autonomous behaviors will affect life and death scenarios in civilian context outside of traditional military settings. And so advances in AI can automate, we know about this, capacity for massive data optimization, predictive intelligence, systems behavioral analysis, and anomaly detection. And relying on such functional augmentation, AI programs can enable autonomy in other technologies and industries that are critical to civilian populations' survival and well-being. So think of automated labs, supply chains in the energy, food, medical, and biotech sectors. Yet, as I will explain, the advent of autonomy also provides an increasing potential to weaponize civilian technologies and supply chains through adversarial attacks waged in cyber operations. So the second shift is what I call tech convergence. So the fast integration of AI across all parts of our life, including health, safety, economy, and security, bears powerful opportunities, including for optimizing conflict prevention. But this convergence also leads to new risks for civilian populations. People's biometrics and biodata, movements and consumption patterns, conversations and emotions are increasingly collected by data capture technologies. For instance, techniques such as facial recognition, gait analysis, mobile biometrics can already analyze the faces and bodies of individuals in moving crowds. So the vast amount of digital information now captured about populations means that more of these routine behaviors can be understood through AI computing. Global responses to COVID-19 have crystallized just how quickly algorithms and computing power can be combined with diverse data sets and used in technologies that monitor and control bodies and populations. I mean, to pick just one example, in South Korea, algorithmic models use geolocation and biometrics data, surveillance camera footage, and credit card data to trace COVID-19 patients. So building on these two shifts, automation and tech convergence, gray zone conflicts, which are offensive operations under the threshold of war, will increasingly target systemic AI and cyber vulnerabilities in civilian and security interfaces. They will interfere with multiple levels of strategic and emergency decision-making and involve broad coalitions of malicious actors, including states, but also proxies and cyber mercenaries. And so in this gray zone context, let me give you two types of AI applications in defensive operations that actually raise critical dual-use implications. So first, in cyber defense, AI's capacity for automating anomaly detection will play a powerful role to detect abnormal and illicit behaviors across large computing networks and to learn how to patch vulnerabilities against evolving cyber threats. Yet, AI malware with behavioral detection capacity can also learn to evade cybersecurity techniques and evolve different kinds of hiding and attack strategy for each targeted acquisition. So in the near future, offensive cyber operations led by deep learning could become more efficient, targeted, difficult to attribute, and likely to exploit vulnerabilities in both AI and human systems. And one pervasive security threat will be new form of hybrid influencing, where malicious actors target the social and psychological vulnerabilities of humans within a chains of command. The goal is to manipulate command and control organizations to compromise their own safety and security. The second example with serious ramifications for civilians is about automated intelligence and surveillance operations. So with the convergence of AI, biometrics, and data capture technologies, the global security industry posits that large amounts of information about populations can be turned into actionable intelligence for threat monitoring and predictive conflict modeling. The goal is, for instance, to better monitor and predict how non-state actors evolve and blend into civilian settings, collude with transnational criminal networks, finance their operations, and adapt their attack strategies to new domains, including cyberspace. With AI programs, military and security experts could also surveil how online hate speech and disinformation contaminate the lifeblood of social media and private messaging applications in countries where ethnic and socioeconomic tensions prevail. So while bearing opportunities, the increasing reliance of modern societies on AI and dual-use technologies makes them vulnerable to exploitation by hostile actors, governments, and non-state actors alike. And this is where new forms of cyber warfare could increasingly produce collective harms, those AI failures or adversarial uses of AI we've been referring to. And indeed, advances in AI and converging technologies have the potential to make attacks more precise to the level of targeted hate speech and populations' barometrics and movements, more deadly, potentially producing security events with biotech and chemical consequences. And these attacks are also potentially more invasive in our everyday lives as they are waged inside our cyber networks and the virtual boundaries of our smart cities and civilian infrastructure. So civilians, including vulnerable populations, could be increasingly targeted. Let me briefly describe for you 3 types of new AI techniques and targets in modern conflicts and in cyber warfare. So a first trend and major concern is the potential for automated behavioral and ethnic profiling in conflict and violent extremism. Increasingly, cyber criminals and illiberal governments have access to a new class of malware that targets users' biometrics. A UN report in 2021 notes that drones equipped with facial recognition capabilities can be exploited by terrorist groups to profile and wage targeted attacks on specific communities. Such form of behavioral surveillance can also help states and non-state actors alike anticipate populations' movements during protests, elections, ceasefire, religious or social events to better enforce control or repression. And the convergence of AI, biometrics, and techniques below the skin is already used in China for profiling based on subpopulations, ethnicity, and phenotype. Yet the coming together of AI and large-scale data collection does not only enable the profiling of people as they live, move, and feel, but the lack of safeguards has enabled state and non-state actors to also identify and capture individuals' deepest fears to mobilize them around divisive issues. And so this leads to a second type of AI threats, which is scaling up cognitive emotional conflicts. So hostile actors may increasingly rely on emotional manipulation and influence operations to spread disinformation and sow social unrest and violent ethnic conflicts. With AI technologies that can synthesize and forward media from scratch, text, images, video, audio samples, the craft of emotional manipulation is becoming ever more powerful, with the potential to inflict harm on specific ethnic groups. And as behavioral data about populations accelerates, malicious actors are increasingly able to rely on AI's capacity for predictive analysis to identify the emotional triggers that lead a subgroup to violence. And in fragility contexts, polarization of large swaths of the population could escalate into clashes between factions involving conflict or in violent extremism. A Deter Trend is about adversarial manipulation of civilian data sets and critical services and infrastructure. And this trend might be the most corrosive as it leads to collective data harms and produces a state of pervasive distrust in our AI and data systems. So emerging as a rising threat are cyber attacks that can manipulate and corrupt the integrity of critical information within civilian and industrial infrastructure. And these cyber operations can then target and weaponize the interdependence between AI, other technologies, and industrial platforms that are critical to the survival, safety, and well-being of civilian populations. Recent studies in AI and cybersecurity confirm that a certain type of deep learning algorithm can be trained to manipulate medical and genomics datasets, opening the door to possible cyber attacks through health, biotech, and biosecurity sectors. Beyond biotech and medical sectors, these adversarial techniques pose similar threats to other data-driven domains. So expanding risks to sabotage of critical infrastructure, industrial platforms, financial security, and governance systems. And the capacity of adversarial algorithms to manipulate data processes and automated protocols provides an increasing potential to weaponize cities' smart technologies, cloud-based services, manufacturing supply chains in different sectors. And such capacity for state and non-state actors alike to damage public confidence in governance institutions, in scientific institutions, in industrial capacity could have powerful long-term implications for peace and security. So where does that leave us in terms of approaching chains of responsibility, issues of accountability and mitigation? And are these normative boundaries even fit to a geopolitical context of multipolar competition? We face two complex challenges. First, as they converge, the technologies become more automated and decentralized, blurring who is responsible for technologies' misuses and failures, leading to what I call atomized responsibility and liability. And in a context of multipolar competition, we also witness a proliferation of intangible transfer of knowledge, sensitive data, algorithms, malware that allow state and non-state actors to co-opt powerful private sector capabilities for population surveillance, adversarial cyber operations, data predation, power, and resource capture. The second challenge is the powerful asymmetries that exist between the private sector and national governments. Core AI capabilities developed by the private sector already play a key role in increasing functionality across a wide spectrum of military and converging applications, including those falling in the hands of non-state violent actors. And so we therefore need to focus on how the private sector will regulate AI and converging tech that have a potential role to play in conflicts. Yet security and ethical priorities of civilian populations affected by conflict are often absent from self-regulation and corporate normative principles. These principles need to be translated and turned into viable normative practices that are conflict sensitive and that can be overseen and tested for transparency and accountability. And in this context, there is an urgent need to anticipate and devise how the private and public sectors, including military sectors, will work together to regulate technologies' dual-use potential. Otherwise, the complex and decentralized supply chains of converging technologies would lead to an unprecedented diffusion of power and dual-use potential in conflicts. I'm going to stop here, but I'm eager to discuss, some of the questions you had around accountability, responsibility, mitigation.
Thank you, Eleanor. Both you and Alex have given us a lot to chew on and think about. I do encourage people to please feel free to add questions in the Q&A. We certainly have a lot to talk about, and I have my own questions that I'd love to explore, but please do feel free to submit your own questions. So let me start with you, Alex. Before we talk about failures, let's talk about successes. You don't talk about successes often enough, I find, and certainly I think there are some. Can you tell me what are the areas where you think AI is either better suited to the task or more accurate, say, than humans are when it comes to AI and military applications?
Better, that's an interesting word, right? I think when you take everything that Eleanor brought to the table, measuring success against those normative constraints is really an issue. But let's take the Chinese example. I'm not now, I want to preface, I don't support this, but from a pure perspective of an ability to control a society, the Chinese have done it, right? So from a coercive perspective, they are using technology to limit the type and range of behavior of their citizens. And now here's one example that's not based on ethnic cleansing and all the rest that's happening. They used AI to diminish the degree and level of jaywalking in certain cities. And this was reported publicly in New York Times and elsewhere. But they did so by simply saying, we can put our facial recognition software at the end of the street and communicate that we're doing this to people who are potentially jaywalking. And then we can link the jaywalker's face, once we decipher who it is, to the database that we have on people. And then we can send them a real-time ticket as a result of their jaywalking. And what was the result, right? What predictively, what would be the result of this? It was a dramatic decline in jaywalking, because there was the certainty of, and the severity of the punishment was a ticket, but it was also an embarrassment. So it played on the cultural norms there as well. And it led to a change in behavior, which was the diminishment of jaywalking. Now we might say, oh, that's just jaywalking, who cares? But it proves a point. It proves a point, and the point is that a success, Besma? I mean, it's a success because it was tailored to a specific problem in a way that you could never do, I would suggest, in Canada or in Europe, Eleanor, but certainly you could do it elsewhere. So that's one area which I think you can categorize this. And then just one more example, right? I think a lot of us still think of AI as fancy math, but it's actually creating strategy. It's actually creating strategic culture. And so that's really fascinating, because and you see this in the way that AI is used in these very complex war-like games. And I'm talking about specific digital games, computer games, right? And from going back to 2019, 2018, you've got Dota 2, you've got StarCraft 2. These are heavy duty games. I don't play them, but they're heavy duty games in which you have logistics and trains and hundreds of different applications and environments. And AI is developing tools and tactics to crush human competitors in these mixed environments. And they're doing so by playing in a way that is unique to AI, right? So the humans have this normal approach to playing these games, and it's deciphering those approaches and providing a new context. What's the point here? In the DARPA's Alpha Dog Fight competition that was successfully completed last year, DARPA is the DoD research wing. They paired AI against aviators, against one aviator, right? It was a competition of AI against AI in a simulated dogfight, two fighter jets fighting against each other. Eleanor, I think you know the result, right? The AI from Huron Systems crushed the pilot who's sitting in a simulated VR system, crushed them 5-0. And I rewatched the video, and I encourage you all to watch the video. It's like a half-day long telecast. The human pilot didn't even get one touch on the AI, right? Not even one. And so, and the end result here is the pilot says, all of the normal ways that I engage with an adversary are out the window. I need to rethink the way I, right? The proof here is to suggest that the AI is doing things better on a tactical and strategic purpose. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying it is actually happening, and we might want to think about it from that ledger of success, failure.
I think it's a really important point, and this is where I always say the value of social science and humanities to technological, conversations. Again, you have to unpack the word success, right? Absolutely. If it's designed, to control behavior, to incentivize behavior either way, then yeah, sometimes it can be very successful. But certainly that doesn't, follow with our concept of civil liberties, doesn't follow our concept of human rights in many ways. So thank you for that. It's a really important point for us to always constantly remind ourselves. Eleanor, did you want to add to that? I have lots of questions for you too, but if you wanted to say anything about that particular question, we'd love to hear your insights too.
Well, I think Alex, perfectly eloquently summarized, where we are gaining successes and functionality from AI. It's really data optimization, predictive intelligence, system analysis, behavior, and anomaly detection. So in cyber defense, anomaly detection, systems behavior analysis, that's extremely important to be able to fight in real time different type of malware, and increasingly adversarial types of malware that are messing with the functioning of AI. And then, of course, this notion of behavioral monitoring, right? Targeted behavioral monitoring at individual, but also population level. And the fact that, if there is no way that a human brain can do, that data optimization on mixed data sets at the same speed as what we see with AI systems. But so if you scale that up, you can really imagine having AI's ears and eyes on the ground, right? And trying to helping with a form of predictive behavioral analysis on the ground, and trying to really get better at situational analysis. The problem is, and the concerns are all about, beyond the question about ethics and human rights implications, the types of data sets, the types of data collection you are using for perfectioning your AI systems, and the type of correlation interferences that happen in the back of the system, how much control and how much understanding we have of those interferences, right? And to some extent, what's missing is the understanding of conflict as we have had it, for a long time by studying things on the ground from a human perspective. And so that's where the black box of predictive systems for conflict analysis could be an issue.
Yeah, no, definitely. Eleanor, let me stay with you. Let me ask you this question about AI failures. How concerned should we be about AI failures across domains such as data collection, threat analysis, and so on?
So this question, it kind of puzzled me a little bit, because I could imagine posing this question in the context of a very specific military application where a computational component, an AI component, is being used, and that would be a discrete and very limited context where you would have to understand what failure means, and you would have to be sure you have enough explainability around this AI computing system is being used in the military context. But I think it's almost more interesting to think about AI failures as all the ways that adversarial attacks can manipulate the functioning of the AI components that we are using through our everyday life, right? Through our critical infrastructure, our critical services, through the way that we optimize data analysis with civilian data sets. So I think I would almost be, keen to look at this notion of failure as what kind of adversarial attacks can be waged on the civilian AI systems we are currently using and scaling up across different sectors. And I think the adversarial data manipulation example is a good one, especially because it doesn't exhibit physical effects, something that could be done that would be very difficult to detect. So if you had automated malware that are getting better and better at manipulating the integrity of some of our civilian data sets and some of the automated protocols we use for running a biotech lab, a supply chain for medicines or things like that, then that's not only a technical failure and an AI failure, it's also producing a state of distrust in our own knowledge and systems, right? In our AI and data systems. It's kind of creating this distrust about, is the lab running as we thought it was supposed to be? Are those systems, those safety control valves still being functioning as we intended to? So I think that's an interest, to me, that side of the notion of failure is almost more interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Alex, staying in the topic of AI failures, I mean, how rigorous is the chain of responsibility when it comes to AI failures? I mean, what happens when the person who's responsible doesn't understand how artificial intelligence is programmed and works in the first place, for example?
I think so. I like Eleanor. I struggled with this question of failure. So before I get to your answer, I had to take a step back and actually define failure for myself as it relates to the AI Deterrence project, but elsewhere. And I think I came up with this idea that AI can fail from an engineering perspective, from a scientific perspective, but also from a social or institutional perspective. And then that gets us to two problem sets. And then the answer depends on what kind of failure we're talking about. So if you think of engineering failure, right? I mean, if AI is an algorithm, then it can be programmed in a bad way, right? It can be programmed to accomplish things that we don't want it to accomplish. Or perhaps we get the reward function inaccurate. We somehow the reward function built into the algorithm is inaccurate, and so the production is something that we don't want. So that's a failure to build the algorithm. Then we have failures of applying proper data. All right, if we're training AI, and we know about AI bias, and AI bias is a result of bias in the human data that we feed the AI. So it's mimicking our own social failures, right? That's a failure of engineering, because I think if you could parse, and I'm not an expert on data, but if you could parse the data, if you could recreate the data and actually suggest that the data itself is pure, 100% unbiased, then maybe we get rid of that engineering process problem. And then finally, the failure from an engineering perspective, when the AI seems to be doing what it's supposed to be doing, but the output is something that is surprising and unwanted, right? So if you think of famously, right, Microsoft published its chat bot online in Twitter, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, Tay, and it was said, look, it's going to be great for machine learning. People are going to engage with this Tay character online, and she's going to learn human language. And within 24 hours, right, we all know the story. Within 24 hours, it was a misogynistic, anti-Semitic, neo-Nazi. It was like they had to pull the plug within 24 hours. That's a failure to imagine the way in which people can spoof, right? It's also a reflection of us and how we engage. Right, so it was actually our true representation, perhaps, of Twitter, which is saying another thing, right? All to say that was a failure. It was an absolute failure, not of engineering, but of inserting the engineer product in the society. Now let's turn to institutional, and I think this is where Eleanor is strongest. But you can imagine that even a worry about engineering failure leads us to not think about and apply and test and improve our own AI, and that would be a failure to apply AI, right? A fear of failing from an engineer perspective stops us from even trying. And I think this needs to be thought of, because others are not scared of failing, right? And this leads us to another question about ethical considerations as they relate to strategic developments. So I think we need to think about what are we willing to risk, and how do we risk that within a sandbox setting that, you know, it's safe to fail within this sandbox that leads us to the type of normative AI, Eleanor, that we want to apply in our society. And then finally, I think there's a failure maybe to match with oversight and all the other mechanisms here, the way that AI engages with human handlers. So this is like the matching of the two, right? Because I don't think the best way is to simply unleash the AI without human supervision. The point is to have a supervised hand-in-hand role with AI. And that hopefully, although again, I don't have the answer here, hopefully that will take care of some of these issues that we're exploring. So when I approach failure, I was thinking from the engineering science and then the social and institutional and governance perspective as well.
Eleanor, do you want to add to that?
No, I think I covered, you know, the way I was approaching this concept, but I think it's brilliant to think about, you know, the ramifications in terms of engineering and strictly technical, and then institutional and social. You know, that leads to this. I think what we are discussing to some extent here is that there is a real need to devise what I would call a theory of no harm, right, in the AI data capture and tech convergence space. And for that, I think we need, that's a little bit the perspective from which I come from, but we need to really understand, and we need an operational understanding of how AI and data permeates these socio-technical systems of conflict. So beyond just, you know, a strictly technical failure and something that can be dealt with specific measures and specific testing, you have all those ways that AI systems and data are actually really permeating the systems of conflict, the socio-technical system of conflict. And one issue that I come across, or that I think is quite simple to understand, but we need to come back to it, is this notion of the role of the private sector, right? So for the military and security professions, this increasing dependence on private sector technology raises important questions of responsibility and accountability. And to close this accountability gap, there is a need to develop agreed methods to assess not only the ethical, but also the security and human rights implications of delegating some elements of military and national security mandates to new technologies, but also new alliances of actors, including private firms in predictive analytics and threat identification technologies. And so for both, for the military and the security professions, there will be a need to develop certain kind of skills, including foresight and policy capacity, and develop cross-field and cross-sectors collaboration to be able to first understand and then mitigate technology's dual-use potential and anticipate unforeseen misuse and operational gaps in new hybrid conflicts. I think really the fact that the notion and nature of conflict is changing is something that we need to keep in mind also.
So let me ask you then, Eleanor, I want to stay with you if I may, so does a human operator, in your view, bear the same responsibility or liability as AI when it comes to making a mistake?
That's a question I'm going to leave for Alex, because I think his expertise is better fitted to answer that one. But again, I see that question posed, you know, in a certain context of, for instance, a military application that has been tested in a sandbox, like we're just saying, or that could be tested pre-deployment, right? So I think that's one setting where at least a lot of review can be done on, you know, explainability, attributability. There are other different types of, you know, normative inversion. There are different types of concepts that we can use for doing technical and legal reviews of the ways that AI are used in methods of warfare and specific weapons. But I think the question of responsibility and liability, when you see how decentralized and converging, right, those technologies can be together, I think that's more where I am getting to some extent, you know, talking about the fact that AI and data capture technologies and other converging technologies are permeating conflicts in unstructured way and complex ways that we don't necessarily map and don't necessarily understand. And that's where, to me, issues of responsibility and accountability have to be posed. So, but I will let Alex answer the more, like, you know, specific question about what happens when you have that tension, right, in a military application.
again, I struggle with this question in advance, and I was thinking about it from a Canadian vaccination process, right? And so we have, as we know, certainly us in Canada, a deep system of checks and balances for gauging emerging technology as it relates to vaccines, and this is obviously coming to a front because of the pandemic and all the rest, right? And what does that system look like? I mean, it's centrally located. It's staffed by government officials that are deeply involved in the technology and understand the technology. There's a huge amount of data that is privately created, but then shared with the public sector. It's piecemeal approach. It's communicated to the public, so there's deep trust, right? At least in Canada, there's trust in the process, and then there's accountability, and there's a lessons learned approach from historical failures, etc. So, from an accountability process, we actually need something like that. If possible, we need something like that for application of AI across the government, not just in the military, but across the government. And so what does accountability start? I think it starts in a democracy. It starts with an open debate like we're having today about the benefits and many challenges that we have in place. So here's one more anecdote I think that gets us to this answer from the AI Deterrence project. We did interviews in Europe on automated border security in the EU, right? And so there's a number of different programs that are being launched and explored, including one that's called border control. And this is a system of it's not military necessarily, but it's the application of facial recognition at the border security level. And the goal here is to try to ease pressure at certain EU border crossings. And so they publicly tested border control and other mechanisms. I think it was in specifically three countries that we looked at, Greece, Hungary, Latvia, at border crossings in which the a person who's trying to cross the border had the option, right? So here's first step, the option to engage with a border person, a border official, or the machine. And if they decide to engage with the machine, then they would engage with this avatar, this AI-generated avatar, who would ask them questions on where they've been, where they're going, etc. And the machine was looking for micro evidence of tension, right, through those biometric pieces that Eleanor brought to the fore, to see whether or not the answers were truthful. And depending on that, then they would build a score for that individual and then pass the baton back to the human guard, saying there's something fishy with this person. You should probably have a second look, and then that would lead to a second step. The point is,
Yeah, go ahead.
The point is that this is going hand in hand with a human guard. It's out in the open. It's a public engagement through academia, public money, and private. The data is available. There was huge contention. People were writing op-eds about this. It came out in the open, and yet, right, the point is to test it within the sandbox and again, it was voluntary basis, right? So there's all these checks and balances. And I think that's the way that we progress this, because otherwise we're going to leave the AI battleground to the areas where that's not happening, the Chinas, the Russias of the world, where that kind of oversight is not happening. And I'm worried about a 5-year, 10-year time frame in which we've passed the baton so far to our adversaries that we're no longer competitive, right?
So I'm curious now about this technology. Are you suggesting that the machine sort of flags it based on the biometric responses, so like stress levels and right, or on the responses themselves?
I think it was on the facial recognition, so flush of the cheeks, the blood pressure in the eyes, dilation, things that your response would you couldn't fake it. Your response, if you were hiding something, you would flesh it out. A human guard wouldn't necessarily see that. It's frightening. I mean, in a way, it's frightening, but it was done in a way that I think leads us to these questions of accountability. And it's done in Europe so that Canadians trust the way that Europeans do it. And it was contentious, and you could read about the debate, and they played with that contention. They didn't try to hide it. They're saying, okay, but let's see. Obviously, the program was a pilot test. I don't think it's going to go on, right, on all the rest. But the point was to see how this works within that sandbox setting.
And I think what you're both getting at is that really, if you're gonna, the application of these technologies are gonna come, right? I mean, this is, I think, what we're trying to say is that eventually it will be used in various ways. In some way, sandboxing it in a democracy where there's civil liberty concerns, are at least protected, you advance the technology in a way that at least you can foresee or potentially see where biases are built in, where there are challenges, before it becomes used in an autocratic setting. Is that what I'm gathering there in the recommendation? Yeah.
Go ahead.
Eleanor?
Yes, exactly. I would say, you mentioned foresee, and that's exactly what I would come at as one of the methods that we should use. So human-centric, conflict-sensitive foresight analysis that can help us better understand and anticipate the type of misuses and abuses that can be done with AI and data capture technologies and even other technologies, because, as I explained, that's really a convergence paradigm. But I think, what foresight would bring to the front, it's not only a method for better understanding, but it's also a method for testing on the ground what ethical and normative solution practices could be used. And so it's really, getting at better methodologies for knowing, what type of misuse could happen, and you can even think about unpredictable outcomes, right? Ways that a civilian technology that doesn't seem to have necessarily a negative implication could be reverse engineered or could be modified or literally misused and abused for producing another outcome. So I give you an example. You have a certain type of deep learning networks, residual neural networks that are used for producing the voice of someone, right? And that can be useful for, in some medical applications, but it's also very useful for audio spoofing, for producing audio spoofing. And so, misleading people by synthesizing the voice of someone, but also for detecting audio spoofing. So as a defense against that misuse. So that's, to some extent, a functional augmentation, a form of dual use that's being produced and created by AI that we need to understand in its context, and we need to be able to, in a sandbox foresight, exercise, we need to be able to map all the different ways the system could be reverse engineered or manipulated for unintended consequences, right? So I think that's in terms of methods. I have other ideas for accountability that are related to actors. But I think this question of methods, we have the same problem in biotechnology, right? So we are trying to understand what dual use means in biotechnologies, genome editing, different type of extremely interesting type of gain of function research you can do, that's kind of, that has potential important risks. So we are getting at this notion of defining what we are really worried about. And doing that means that you need those methods from being able to anticipate and envision different tracks, different ways that technologies can be misused and can also fall in the hands of different types of actors and be co-opted also by authoritarian regimes. So that's for the methods, and then there are a few other ideas I have for the way that actors can work together when it comes to accountability.
Well, did you want to expand on that? Because I think this is really where I'd like to talk, move our conversation now, is about responsibility and accountability of AI.
Yeah, I think
share more ideas.
You had an interesting thought, when we discussed and prepared this discussion. You were talking about the tension between transparency, openness versus secrecy, right? And I think, so one of the first priority that actors need to work on is this notion of due diligence and non-proliferation. And so I think we need to get, it's exactly at what Alex described with the example of the EU border application. It's to get at better public-private partnerships. And in this case, it would be a military, security, and AI industry partnerships, where this notion of due diligence and non-proliferation could be designed and thought about, right? And in this context, one of the first tension that comes in, it's this tension between expectations of transparency and explainability, an ethos of openness, and the need for secrecy and security in dual use research and innovation. So we probably need to explore different type of openness models in this field of military and defense innovation, where either we have data sharing regimes that are actually promoting safety and security. I think we also need to see those military, security, and AI industry partnerships better monitor intangible transfer of knowledge and tech know-how that can happen on open platforms. It can also happen on illicit platforms where algorithms, training data sets, services even mentorship is being shared. So you have this notion of what kind of openness models do we use? How do we deal with this tension between openness, transparency versus secrecy and security? Monitor intangible transfer of knowledge, and then phase gate processes, right? How can we think about phase gate processes that incentivize tech firms and engineers to consider potential misuses of AI and converging tech during the full tech life cycle? And the goal would be to be sure that sensitive dual-use technologies remain in the hands of strategic actors in the military and security sectors and do not spread to organizations that fall outside of the scope of diligence, of due diligence. But doing this, thinking about how we design those phase gate processes is quite complicated. This could be applied to intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance techniques, could be applied to target tracking and recognition techniques or other techniques in cyber operations. And then increasingly, the military and security professions will also need to develop their own technical auditing capacity, right? So be sure that the AI and tech supply chains that are used for procuring technologies to the military are themselves safe and have no backdoors that could literally, produce anomalies as part of hardware and software that would be procured to military security and peacekeeping forces. So those are, other kind of entry points to work on inside this public-private sector collaboration.
Alex, can you pick up on that and really take us to the conversation about, particularly when it comes to national security or defense establishment, they're not used to this kind of conversation, right? Of sort of, being open and transparent about process. I mean, I love this example of the border services. I think it's a really great way of thinking about how to be the most ethical in a difficult situation, but still have that sandboxing opportunity. So yeah, I mean, how do you in your work and your thinking of this, how do you sort of attempt to think about this responsibility and accountability aspect with agencies that are usually never think about being transparent or open or accountable, frankly?
I think the culture has changed slightly, and I'm pointing to the US mostly. So the U.S. military, the U.S. government, right, is heavily heavily involved in AI excellence. But like Eleanor suggests, a lot of the movement in this space is is owned by the private sector. And so they've had to engage with upstarts, not the traditional military industry, but others that are much smaller, much more nimble, and are dual use. And so the culture, I'm not privy to this conversation, but my understanding from talking to people in the US is that the culture has changed such that they are finding those ways to break down the barriers of suspicion, that exactly as Eleanor described it. And part of the end state is to say to potential industry partners is, if we don't find a way to collaborate, others in the secrecy bucket will. And if we don't, right? So the bottom line is there is this notion, at least in the US, of an international, and I'm going to say it, arms race, right? And that I don't love the word, right? Because it's not an arms. AI is just an application that leads to perhaps arms race. But the point is that there is the open model that Eleanor very eloquently described, and the secrecy model. And right now, the secrecy model potentially has an upper hand in terms of generating the kinds of data that they need to generate the powerful tools that they want. And they get that data because they don't have the ethical, normative, legal qualms that we have in Europe and Canada and elsewhere. And so again, I love the idea of a normative foresight and the scenarios, but the scenario is, if you push this 10 years out, that we lose some competitive advantage in this space in terms of industry, in terms of economics, in terms of cybersecurity, and in military application. And so the goal, at least in the United States, is to push the conversation about open and collaborative nature of AI development by pointing to that ultimate future that you don't necessarily want, and say, help us build this future such that we can build this appropriately. And I would add one more. I love Eleanor's checklist of how to do this. I would add that there must be a multilateral component to it. And I'll suggest that, that right now you've got France moving in one way, Germany moving in another, Canada another, US, and these are allies, right? And they're allies that are meant to engage in a geopolitical space together. But I can imagine a future in which there are distinctions within AI governance models that doesn't allow those actors within the NATO or G7 construct to cooperate and to intervene together. Right? So if you imagine the problems of interoperability that we had engaging in Afghanistan, now add AI interoperability into the mix. So some actors won't take that data. Some people won't take that because it hasn't been vetted. Some people will use that and inform troops, but others won't. This is super messy. It's another wedge issue that is embedded within the larger Western alliance structure that impedes action that may be needed, right? And so again, if we don't move as a concerted effort as some form of a multilateral on some form of multilateral consensus, you end up in a future where you've got players that you will play with, others that you won't, because you don't trust the type of governance structures that they have for AI. And that would be pretty bad, again, for the way that we engage. I have one more point. Oh, yes. And finally, multilateralism, from our perspective, pushes the international norms that we would like to create, right? Eleanor started very strongly here. I mean, the norms that we have at the local level are important, but how do you elevate those at the national level? So if we're in a competition for these different approaches for AI excellence, how do we elevate ours as the model that is not only just, but also most beneficial to everybody? We do that by showing proof of concept within the multilateral setting, and then we use the governance structures that we have at the UN, G7, and elsewhere to elevate that norm and collect actors, just like we did with chemical weapons, just like we're doing with nuclear weapons and all the rest. And so this is the long game, right? The long game is to find a way to do it here, find a way to do it the multilateral, push our agenda on the international community. Otherwise, again, the dystopian future is one in which we do not dictate AI excellence because we have pulled ourselves out of the competition.
That's really, really helpful. And if I can pick up the question about the multilateral aspect, and Eleanor, I've noticed you've worked in a number of fantastic, multilateral organizations. I mean, where would you see this? Like, where do we start? I mean, I couldn't help but hear, Alex talk about allies, and you would think this is kind of where NATO should be, right? You have the Center of Excellence for cyber. Is that where you would start? I mean, is this sort of like a UN protocol that, if it's going to be equivalent to a non-proliferation treaty? I mean, where would you begin? And of course, in all of these international kinds of efforts, they have to be kind of built. You kind of slowly scaffold them into agreements. But where would you think is most effective for us to begin the conversation?
That's an excellent question and a tough one. To some extent, what we are discussing here is this notion of normative leadership, right? Where does that, where we can promote that concept the best? To some extent, so they are existing for where discussions have progressed, but maybe not as much as we would need it, especially in terms of accountability. So we had the two UN groups on responsible behavior in cyberspace, the open-ended working group, and then the 6GGE. So those have helped tremendously in kind of mapping the divergences and the critical issues over which states are conflicting, or over which they don't want to position themselves in a formal way because they want to be, in charge of how to use different type of cyber techniques and AI techniques in the future, and not necessarily be limited in what we could call, their sovereignty or their models of technological development. So on that front, it's a very interesting exercise to see where there are differences and divergences, but it's a very heavy machinery to try to progress on a concept such as accountability, and especially on normative practices. So more of the operational sides of the norms. Something I find quite interesting, and I'm going to go back to this notion of, I'm going to compare again with another technological domain, which is the biotech one. But I think it's because, to me, AI and biotechnologies, and to some extent some of the techniques in cybersecurity, are almost closer to each other than what we see in the nuclear context or some of the other domains of non-proliferation. In particular, because those technologies are they have an important civilian component. They are extremely integrated in our everyday life, and they keep evolving at a fast pace and decentralizing increasingly and quite at a fast pace. So with that kind of technology, I think what we need maybe urgently And the UN could play a role in that domain, or we need to think about it as at a global scale. But is this notion of capacity building? So creating the incentives and capacity for governments, private sector, and academia to collaborate, to participate in regulatory and accountability regimes. And so it's multilateral, but even more multi-stakeholder dimension, right, of the issue. And when I mentioned the biotech sector, it's because there is a really interesting platform that exists in biotech, which is this International Gene Synthesis Consortium. So it's a global group, not only of experts, it's mainly private firms. And so you have the private sector that's really well integrated. And that consortium exists to prevent illicit gene synthesis at a global scale. So to some extent, the fact that we can now synthesize, different pieces of fragments of genes or genes that could be used in lethal application, and that synthesis can be now almost completely decentralized. That's a non-proliferation issue. It's a very interesting problem to think about. But to some extent, it's close to an AI problem, because in both cases, you have this pattern of decentralization. You are facing technologies that are extremely modular and decentralized, right? You mentioned so many times, how this decentralization was a problem for responsibility and accountability. So what that consortium did is that by pulling together both experts and private sector actors, they are getting together, they are building together a screening mechanism to prevent illicit gene synthesis, which means that they are thinking together about what genetic functionality, what genetic functions should be prevented, or what we should look at when we deem a genetic application dangerous or not dangerous. And what's so interesting here is that this global platform is creating not only capacity building, but also economy of scale, making this responsible screening affordable for an array of tech and military providers, for smaller companies. I mean, it's really kind of, helping smaller companies that do gene synthesis. It's helping them understand how to do a responsible screening to be sure we don't get at a big problem with gene synthesis, right? So how could we do that for AI? I mean, it would mean getting experts and private sector engineers to think about the type of functionality in AI that are increasingly dual use, that are problematic. When we imagine that technology could be decentralized and could be democratized increasingly. And if we could do that at a global scale, that type of reflection, and in a way that creates capacity building, economy of scale, that helps different private sector actors and different different actors across sectors, right, to understand how to apply responsible innovation in AI, I think that would be extremely useful. So there are models of institutions that are able to work at a global scale on an extremely difficult technology and evolving technology, but kind of creating this capacity in foresight thinking, right? So how do we do that for AI? I think that's kind of a next step for the domain.
So Alex, can you help us with understanding sort of the countries, like what countries are more amenable to this approach? I mean, you have a great sense of, where countries are with terms of their ethical guidelines and so forth, and the rules and regulations. But, particularly, and let's focus on, I mean, we can all pick on, it's so easy to say, well, China's an outlier, right? I mean, in the application of AI, but, from the, let's say our close allies, I mean, who do you think are going to be the most difficult to sort of move this conversation forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. So as part of this project, we did, I think it was 25 miniature case studies, nation-based case studies. We also did a multilateral case study on NATO. And we found, and we kind of divided them into Canadian allies, Canadian partners and friends, and potential Canadian adversaries, right? And the adversary bucket is classic, China, Russia. And I think we had Iran as well, but it's a small player. I think what's really fascinating is where it's not the traditional allies that we always engage with, it's with those partners that we sometimes engage with. So it's the Singapore, it's Israel, India. And what we found actually was that, and this is preliminary finding still, but we found that the strategic culture of the state in question shapes the way that it approaches AI. So if you approached, so let's take Germany, for instance. Germany was it seems to be very hesitant to use certain applications of AI because of the history of that state. Nazism, huge ethnic issues, and all the rest. I'm not going to go over the history of Germany, but they were very hesitant for that use. Whereas Israel, by juxtaposition, in a dangerous neighborhood, and have a readier scene between civilian practice and the military, was more willing to absorb certain lessons for the benefit of national security, based on their, again, historical context. And so again, the lessons there was that there are deep-seated issues that most countries address or have to go through in terms of understanding and how to push through with AI. And that leads us to an interesting model where you've got, as Canadians, an interesting model where you've got different partners and allies working in different ways to engage with this space. And because Canada is somewhat behind in some of these applications, we can pick up the pieces and the best lessons learned and all the rest. So it's not terrible to be a laggard in this case. We can pick up some lessons and engage those lessons with the way that we want to build the system in place. Backing up a tiny bit, I think Eleanor is has hit it on the head, right? It's also it can't just be multilateral, meaning state on state. We need triple P. We need partnerships with public and the private sector to engage with this. And because it's the engineers, or really, right? Because going back to engineering failure versus institutional failure, engineers are the people creating some of these machines that we're grappling with from a social science perspective. That means we need them to engage with us, and we need them to build this culture of privacy first, security first, and privacy by design, and all those principles that are embedded in some of this. And I don't think that's for the state to lead. I don't think that's a government note. I think that's for the culture of engineers to lead. And I think we do see that in certain pockets, certainly in Canada and US and elsewhere. So if you could elevate that kind of culture from the engineering perspective, and then through the governance models, those and others that Eleanor brought to the front, then you start populating a global conversation about AI and governance in an appropriate way. And so I think this is, right, you build the taboos at the international level, like we did against chemical weapons and nuclear weapons. And I appreciate Eleanor's point that, cyber AI and genes, that's a different realm, right? There's dual use. And yet we still built taboos for how to use and not use certain weapon systems. And so we can imagine a similar sort of taboo for these technologies as well. So I think it's deep partnerships among states, between states, within other partners. It has to be global. It should be led from the front, right? And it leads, I think, to an understanding of the kind of space that we want to establish for ourselves in competition with others, right? Keeping our eye on that as well.
Yeah. Wow. So much to think about. You've really given us a lot to kind of digest here. One of the things I'm curious about as well, and really, I think both of you have kind of touched upon it, but I'm wondering if we could just be a little bit more explicit, is, what is the process, right? From when we think about accountability, from a prototype to approval, like where should accountability fall in? I mean, is it sort of before we even talk about the technology itself? Is it when it becomes, ready before application? I'm trying to think of, in other applications when we've done this, we would sort of have broad stakeholder consultations, right? I mean, this would require us to think about, okay, well, other public policies, you'd want to know what's the impact on the most vulnerable. I know certainly when we think about here in Canada, I could see where certain ethnocultural communities would be the most concerned, right? This is going to really impact us more so than others. Is there going to be racial profiling with this kind of technology? It's, as we all know, anything artificial intelligence is only as good as the information you put into it, or the data that you put into it. And so if we skew the very beginning of collecting that data, we're going to really just have a biased process right to the end. So, I mean, do you have examples of where we've sort of, really done this well, and said, this is where in this flow of work, right, where we should start thinking about this conversation? And open to either one of you.
I can go first. I mean, it's not a perfect example, but again, let's borrow lessons from other technologies. So like financial technology, right? Blockchain technology, all this new age, not that new anymore, but new age applications to the banking and financial system. The model that many, and this is a Canadian story, right? It could be a Canadian story, but the model applied by these upstart financial tech corporations was to approach the state and regulators and say, look, we have this new technology, we'd like to prove the concept, right? And so they find a way, again, using the Sandbox model to prove the tech itself, to acquire the data that they need from different public or private domains, to then play around within that closed framework, such that failures would be encased, if you will, but successes would also be evident. Then there was a collaborative assessment of the findings within the sandbox, and then slowly but surely a rolling out that is in hand with regulators, because now they work together until finally it meets the public, right? And then you have new access to the types of financial systems that we're building. And so this was it's a slow step-like approach. It's a little cumbersome because you're working with the bureaucracy. I think where this doesn't really work is in the space that Eleanor is studying, where the change is occurring very quickly, very rapidly, and it's diffuse. And so, there are not a lot of roadblocks in place. And so why would I join the regulators to slow me down, right? And yet, I think there's a model here with other technology that we might want to absorb for at least the best and most appropriate lessons. And then, Besma, that's when you insert, to your point, right? You insert certain ways in which accountability becomes the primary aspect within this hand-holding process. And the bottom line here is, at the end, you've got a good product that is vetted, it's properly regulated, and it's useful to Canadians, etc. That's going to make you money, right? So the point is, like, this process is to the benefit of everybody, and it upholds our own societal desires and norms and institutions and all the rest. So I think there's a vision. It's a matter of making sure that the system works in that way.
Eleanor, do you have something to add to that?
Yes, Alex really well, delineated one of the problems that we are facing both with AI and with biotechnologies, is the fact that those technologies are evolving fast, converging, and extremely modular, right? So what's difficult is to understand the type of dual use we will be facing, not just now, but 5 years from now, and then 10 years, and also what type of dual use we'll face depending on the context where the application is being used, and the normative context also where it's being used. So one example, I would say that what's needed here is to approach governance and accountability as an evolving collective experiment. So what we need to do is try to progressively clearly define what we're worried about when developing converging technologies that have a potential for proliferation. And I think, again, the biotech sector is probably one of the most interesting places where you see those exactly, or I would say very similar challenges playing out. And so, when you think of biotechnologies and all the corrosive, transformative, but also corrosive implications that they could have, and how important it is to figure out, how to do non-proliferation in biotech. That's where, there is one example I would think that's really interesting. It's the International Genetically Engineered Machine Competition, so IGM, which is it's an interesting learning journey and adventure that brings together the next generation of biotech engineers, students, private sector actors, academia, basically the engineers and the thinkers of tomorrow in the field of biotech, right? And in this competition, you have often very young teams of engineers that are trying to understand, what biotech application will be the next very useful and interesting endeavor to invest in. And so they do this exact process of sandboxing and foresight analysis around a certain type of sometimes application, sometimes it's more about the technology itself, right? Really trying to understand what can be done, how it can be used, but what are also the long-term implications, and not just the technical potential failures and misuses, but also the more institutional and social implications that could come from from biotechnologies. And they learn to iterate, they learn to do that together, they learn to document their processes, and increasingly what they do is that they help us think about dual use in biotechnologies and how it's evolving, how the definition is evolving, and how we need to think about the appropriate safeguards for such a modular technology. I think it's exactly the same challenges we're facing with AI. It's a general purpose technology that could be, so many applications are actually dual use. You kind of need it for a certain type of sector, but then the way it could be reverse engineered or misused are adamant, right? So how do we imitate that process of foresight, of iteration, of sandboxing with cross-field and cross-sector actors that are to some extent bottom up, right? You don't wait for a lot of financing or for permission to think about this. You do it as a collective experiment, right? I think that's I don't want to take too much time as we're approaching the end, but I don't know if you see what I'm trying to describe with this bottom-up model, governance and accountability as a collective experiment, where upfront you have foresight, cross-field and cross-sector collaboration, and we don't necessarily wait for national strategies to converge, right? We're kind of doing bottom-up because the technologies are developing so fast, and then probably that will help states better understand and help define their own normative architectures.
Wow. Thank you so much. There's just so much information here and ideas, and you've really provided a lot of thought-provoking details. So I want to thank you both, Alex and Eleanor, for your time today. It really provided a lot of insight. As you know, we're planning on developing all of these great interventions and ideas into a series published by CG. So I really look forward to seeing that come to fruition. Thank you to Kirsty for putting this all together, Jean-Francois for the great intellectual leadership on this, and to the audience, thank you so much. We'll be posting this also online after, so people can take a look at it again. And I know there's some folks who couldn't make it in this hour, but we'll sure to send them the link to the video as well. So thank you both for a fantastic conversation. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you so much, Besma. Thank you so much, Alex.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.